Hello and welcome to the Cardiac Cats YouTube channel. I'm your host, Jacob Shorba, and today we're going to break down Jacksonville's approach to the 2023 offseason and evaluate it. So with that said, we're going to jump right into this. So first things we want to talk about are really what the team has done so far, because obviously the offseason still has a ways to go. We've got these next waves of free agency, we've got the draft, and we even have signings that could take place after the draft. And then, even past that, you're talking about training camp. So a lot still has to happen. But at the same time, we also know a lot about how this team is going to look this next year, what the Jaguars are probably going to do moving forward, and really what their goal is over the next few years. And so we're going to start with one of the first moves that we saw this offseason. Jacksonville ended up extending a player that a lot of people thought could be cut. A lot of people thought he would be gone this offseason before last year started and even after the year was over, just based on the cap situation. And the guy we're talking about is Roy Robertson Harris. So I want to take a look at him for a second and kind of break this down for you guys. So Roy Robertson Harris, his deal before with the team was for $7.8 million a year over 3 seasons. That's what he was being paid. And he was going into his last year. The only money that would be dead money was the money that they had already gave him in a signing bonus. So he was going to save the team almost $8 million if they moved on from him. Instead, Jacksonville signed a 3-year, $21.6 million contract with him, which gets added on to this next season. And overall, that contract, those 3 years, is $7.2 million a year. So this is, for us, really the one example of a player taking a pay cut to stay with the team. And so, obviously, a lot of people are going to like him for that. A lot of people liked him before just for the things he said this year, the way he played late in the season, his demeanor that he had in Jacksonville's wildcard game really told you a lot about the kind of leader that Roy Robertson Harris is. And so I would give this move a very good grade for the team because you got back a key piece, one that's probably a bit undervalued. You got him back for cheaper, and you took out one of your biggest needs from that list of needs, because we all thought, hey, Jacksonville's got to go after an interior defensive lineman. That's going to be big. And could they still? Yeah, they could. There's no reason not to, as long as you have the opportunity for it that makes sense. But at the same time, you can feel pretty comfortable with who you've got there because you've got Fatukasi, who's really good at stopping the run. You've got Roy Robertson Harris, who's a developing pass rusher, played a lot better to end the season. You love that about him, especially as a leader. And I think Devon Hamilton's really turned into a solid player for this team and a good draft pick. Even though he's not necessarily a guy who's going to break the bank after his rookie contract, but he's a solid contributor to this team and I think a bright spot for the Jaguars. So this was probably one of the best moves that Jacksonville made this year because they eliminated a need, they kept a valuable leader on defense, and they prevented a hole from being created on this team. You also look at the cap numbers. They decreased this cap number for the first year, I believe, by a little over $4 million. I think it's like 4.3 million to be exact. You see the cap number the next year is still low. And then you're talking about 9 million roughly over each of these next 2 years. That's 9 million a year. And then you've got a couple void years where it's really not a whole lot of money going against the cap, about 4 million over those seasons. So really good deal for Jacksonville. One of the first ones they did. Definitely got me excited about the direction they were going. However, what Jacksonville did with a lot of other players, I think you could argue is kind of questionable. It's not an approach everyone likes because you look at this team, it's a team that was not as good as Kansas City, was not as good as perhaps the Cincinnati Bengals. I think they were better than Buffalo, although a lot of people will probably disagree with that. I think that just the mentality of this team, like they would have probably beat them in the playoffs. I will stand by that. And I think they're a very talented roster still. But a lot of people feel like Jacksonville needed to improve, even past the Calvin Ridley deal. So there's a lot of contention about not signing a single external free agent throughout the first week of free agency. It's pretty unheard of around here, especially coming after a season where the team spent the most in free agency history. So we'll talk about all that in general more at the end, but I think the Roy Robertson Harris move was one of those moves that a lot of people universally liked for this team. I really didn't see anyone say a whole lot bad about it. So that's one of the first things they did. They also restructured multiple players. Those include Christian Kirk, Foye Oluokun, Brandon Scherf, and Zay Jones. Cleared up a lot of money for this team. I believe it was around $45 million overall that was split up into signing bonuses. $9 million of that hit this season. So ultimately they saved about $36 million from all of those restructures. So it's a good amount of money for the team. And what that does as well is over all these next seasons, 2024 through 2027, you're adding on cap hits for the team. So we see here, all these cap hits add up. Now, Roy Robertson Harris, that's another cap hit you can throw in with that, but we're kind of talking about the four, excluding him. You've got around $9 million or so. And so it does impact the team a fair amount down the road. Not too much when you compare it to other teams, but hey, it's a move they had to make, right? Had to save money, had to find a way to get under the cap, and they wanted to bring back some important pieces to the team. One of the other moves they made was franchise tagging Evan Ingram. So that was a big hit to the cap. I think it's one of the reasons as well why the team may not have done much to this point, because that's $11 million roughly that goes against the cap this year. You can't spread that out. You can't do much with it. You know, maybe you could add void years, but I don't think that makes any sense for a 1-year contract. You know, and so it's definitely not an ideal situation. But at the same time, we saw the tight end market collapse. We saw players go for way cheaper than we expected. I think it was Mike Gesicki who he signed on to a deal that max was worth like $9 million. What Evan Ingram got last year, but the base value is like half of that. It's not a great deal. And so you saw all that happen, and I think if you're Jacksonville, you're kind of happy that Evan Ingram was not signed to a long-term deal yet, because I think that could possibly help drive down the price a little bit, especially if you get it done this offseason. Perhaps it doesn't, but I think it could help. And, you know, ultimately, if we were to go back with hindsight, look at things with, you know, the 2020 vision you get from that, you might say perhaps the best thing would have been to let Evan Ingram hit the market and just match any offer he got. You know, but I'm also not sure he would have stuck around here. So I totally get the route they took. I think it's fine. I think it's going to work out well for the team. And, you know, maybe there's even a shot that he doesn't come back after this next year. Maybe he still wants a ton of money and learns that out in the free agency market that he probably won't get it. You know, or maybe you move on to another tight end. But I think you got the best yearly deal you could get without letting him hit free agency. So, you know, I would ultimately grade that pretty well. Now, one of the other moves they made, pretty simple one. We knew this was coming. Shaquille Griffin was released from the team, saved the team about $13 million. The dead cap hit about $4 million. So that's money that he's already been paid to this point. So Shaquille Griffin, this was a move that had to come. He's a player who wasn't really on the field a whole lot this last year. He's not necessarily just awful, but the way he played this last year was not good. You know, he was a liability in games, and I would argue the team did lose games because of him. I still think he's a better player than that. I think that perhaps you can blame some of that on the injury that was lingering for him, but at the same time, he wasn't worth $17 million against the cap. So I think Jacksonville really made the decision they had to there. They tried trading him, weren't able to find a suitor, which, you know, that makes sense, and they ended up releasing him. So the way they went about it was the proper way, and, you know, that money is better spent on the other players on this roster right now. And hopefully for Shaquille, he gets an offer from another team, something decent, and I hope his career turns around for him, but it just didn't work out in Jacksonville simply. So after that, we're going to talk about a lot of the stuff that happened during free agency, once the market really opened. And so we had so far 3 players from Jacksonville. Maybe I'm missing one, but I believe it's 3 that have signed on to other teams, officially not back with the Jaguars. The first one we heard about was Jawan Taylor. Got signed for $20 million a year, 4 seasons, 3 of them fully guaranteed, to play left tackle for the Kansas City Chiefs. Crazy move, in my opinion. Absolutely crazy. I think it's still a high floor move, regardless of that, because if you don't look at the money, like, you're still getting a really good right tackle. But I don't know if he's going to translate to the left. You know, it didn't work out in college for him. They tried, and he had to stay on the right side. That's really where he's played his best football. He's not a guy who's played on the left side, and you're putting him in probably the most important position in the league, protecting Patrick Mahomes' blind side. And so I do think it is high floor, though, because they can move him back to the right, and I think he's a good player on that side, and I think the Chiefs can coach him up. But hey, Phil Rauscher also did a ton to coach him up as a player too. So it's not like he's going from a bad coach to a good coach. And obviously both head coaches are good as well. Andy Reid is the best in the league right now, but we're not talking about, you know, a player going from a terrible situation to a great situation. So I think for Jacksonville, you look at what Jawan Taylor was paid. I think you're happy you didn't re-sign him at this point in the year. I think you're happy you didn't match that, because that's just simply too much money. Way too much money for this team. And so, you know, if you could go back in time, like, you would probably have signed him mid-season to an extension or signed him right before the year. But at that point, you didn't know it was going to keep up. You didn't know he was going to be a great player all the way through the season. And so with the knowledge they had at the time, I think they did exactly what they had to. And so, you know, this is where we're left. You know, Jawan Taylor departs. Team's going to save money from that. And they've got Walker Little waiting in the wings, a player who took him to the brink in training camp last year. In the middle of Jawan Taylor's best season as a pro, Walker Little did that in his second year. He came in as a left tackle, played great there. I think you're still confident if you're Jacksonville. You just need a swing tackle because injury issues could arise this season. So we saw Jawan Taylor go for a really big deal. We're happy the Jaguars didn't sign him to that deal, quite frankly. And for Arden Key, I think this was one that stung a lot more. You know, this was an amount, it's $7 million a year, that we felt Jacksonville could match. We felt like they could do that. They had the money, but ultimately they decided to let him go. They offered him apparently a lot less, according to what Arden Key claims. And by all accounts, seems like Arden Key's thrilled to be on the Tennessee Titans. Absolutely elated. And so that's frustrating as a fan. Very frustrating to watch, and I'm sure we all feel that way. There's a lot of jokes going around about him because of, you know, him talking about how he changed the city and all this, and not sure he means it exactly as in, you know, him alone, he did it. I doubt that, but obviously watching him go to the Titans, I'm not as big of a fan of him, you know, as we should be. That's our duty as Jacksonville Jaguars fans, right? So I think Jacksonville could have matched that. Perhaps that's one thing I would have changed this offseason. Would have been nice to keep Arden Key around, but here's something to consider. You know, something I forgot, but is mentioned on Locked On Jaguars, and is a really good point. We got Jordan Smith on this team. We got a guy they traded up for in the 4th round 2 drafts ago. He was slated for a pretty big role this last year. He was going to be the guy as the 3-4 outside linebacker playing in Arden Key's snaps there. And unfortunately, he suffered an injury, went down, and Arden Key ended up having more playing time on this team because of that. But he was going to cut into his role on the team. So I think Jordan Smith, if he comes back and is, you know, what you're hoping from him, I think you can argue he replaces what Arden Key had. Not necessarily that he's as good of a player right off the bat, right? But it's a guy with a lot of upside. He's a fast pass rusher. He's something that the team's missing because they need that speed element to the pass rush. So we can be excited about that. The team had a guy that I think they're still very confident in that can play a role in the pass rush. You know, was picked at a decent point in the draft, and this is really the part in his career where we're going to expect him to break out a bit more. So, looking at all that, I can understand why Arden Key's not back on the team. Doesn't mean it's a perfect move, but hey, you're still saving money. You got a guy on the roster you feel confident in. Now it really comes down to making sure you at least have one other person in that room to help out, because I would not want Jordan Smith coming off an injury as my third guy. As a fourth, yeah, that's great. But they need another guy, and I hope that they bring back DeJuan Smoot, because if they do, then hey, we're in a good situation next year. I really do believe that. I think we're in just as good of a situation as we were, and even just bringing back Smoot, you have as many pass rushers as you did in the playoffs. You know, because DeJuan Smoot was out then. He replaces Arden Key, who was in then. And then you got Jordan Smith as well. And if you have no injuries, then you got more than what you had in the playoffs. And that's without signing anyone externally, drafting anyone. So things to consider. And then we saw Chris Manhertz. He went to the Denver Broncos, $3 million a year. You know, it's a deal I think Jacksonville could have made. I understand why they didn't. I don't think it's a huge deal. I think ultimately, as long as you get someone who can block well, that'd be good. But we also have seen Doug Peterson really decide to utilize tight ends who are more receiving threats than great at blocking. You know, I think there's even a shot that he goes and spends a high pick on another guy like that, like a Dalton Kincaid, or goes after a Luke Musgrave. I think we could see that. So, you know, it's not a terrible loss, but it is still a loss. Manhertz was a good guy for the culture, for the locker room as well, and he was, when he came into Jacksonville, arguably the best blocker at the tight end position. Now, as a receiver, he wasn't much, but, you know, he could still do it if you need him to, and so it's a loss for sure, but not one that's going to kill the team either. And so now we talk about, you know, the re-signings that the team got, the internal ones, guys they brought back that we haven't mentioned, and we'll talk about compensatory picks before we really just break this down. Andrew Wingard, CJ Beathard, JaMychal Hasty, Adam Gotsis, and Trey Herndon all returned to the team. I think every deal was pretty favorable for the Jaguars. They didn't break the bank on any of them. You know, you could argue they could have just went out and got a veteran minimum guy, but I think these were all players who were solid for Jacksonville. You know, Beathard's important in the quarterback room. Wingard's been a game changer when he's went on the field, as crazy as that is. He's a guy who can go make the big play. We've seen it consistently. I think he's proven it pretty well at this point. JaMychal Hasty ended up filling in pretty well for ETN when he was out. And so you like having him back. Adam Gotsis, for the limited snaps he had pretty good production. And they gave him the long-term security he wanted, and I think that's ultimately a win. And Trey Herndon, you know, we can trash him, of course, like be like, hey, he's not the greatest nickel guy. He was a liability at points, right? But the truth is, he played better as the season ended. He was okay in the nickel. He was not a massive liability when the season was ending. He was not perfect either. He was not necessarily a guy who was a plus on the roster. But this is a smart signing for the team because now you have really good insurance at the position. Not elite insurance, but still really good insurance. And so I'm cool with it. Happy they brought him back. Wish it was cheaper, but I'd still pay a guy $2.6 million to play backup there. I think that's fine. You know, and we saw last year he had to because Griffin went down. So that's a good move. As far as compensatory picks, talk about that for a moment here. If we go on the same website, we can view current compensatory picks, what they're projected at. And so we see Jacksonville currently holds the highest compensatory pick, not for this draft, but for the next draft. Something that's kind of shocking because last year the two highest picks were from Jacksonville's signings to the team. Usually they're the team that's awarding others with compensatory picks because they're getting their free agents. Not that Jacksonville loses picks, but they sign guys, which causes those teams to get them. Instead, this offseason, it's Kansas City signing one of our players, giving us the top compensatory pick in the draft. Assuming we don't make a huge signing, that will stay there. We also got one for Arden Key, currently in the 6th round, likely to stay there. And yeah, Chris Manhertz, officially not a compensatory pick. Was for a while, but not one we necessarily expected to stick around. And we could see more. It comes down to what happens with the remaining guys on this team. So, maybe if Marvin Jones gets signed by another team to a decent deal, we'd see a 6th rounder from that. I think that's possible. Maybe it's a 7th. I don't think you'd get one for Dewan Smoot just because it's going to be a cheap deal this next year because of the injury. And Dan Arnold wasn't really paid a whole ton. That's going to be the same deal that Manhertz got, so you're probably not getting one from that. So that's the compensatory pick situation. They're going to have a nice 3rd round pick for this team next season because Jawan Taylor walked. So am I all right with that? Yeah, I think it's good for the team. When you lose a guy, you're hoping he gets overpaid because then you're going to get a better compensatory pick back. So I'm all for it. I'm cool with it. So let's talk now about where the salary cap is and where the team is. So your losses at this point: Jawan Taylor, you replace him with Walker Little. You need depth at tackle. That's the change. And Walker Little is a guy that could play as great as Jawan Taylor did. It's possible. And then Arden Key, I think he's a guy that you replace with Jordan Smith most likely, unless they're getting a nice edge rusher in the draft, which, hey, that's great if they do. But Jordan Smith is probably going to be their replacement. Not as great right now, but still has a ton of upside. Guy who could end up being better. He's got to prove it, but we can at least be excited. He's got the opportunity, and I hope he takes advantage of it. So they've replaced those players already with in-house guys. Chris Manhertz, they have not done that with, I will say that, because they don't have another tight end on the roster who really fits into what he does. Farrell would probably be their blocking guy if they want to get him involved, but he's not as good of a blocker. When we look at guys remaining, Corey Peters and Darrell Henderson, not really ones we're going to count because Peters is retiring and Henderson was released from the team before they even played a game with him. So, like Marvin Jones, you lose a contested catch guy, but you brought in Calvin Ridley. So it's an upgrade. I'd still like to see Marvin Jones back if they can get him on a really cheap deal, but who knows if that happens. It really depends on what other teams offer him. I think he'd stick around in Jacksonville if he doesn't have a whole lot of other options, or at least really good options. Dewan Smoot, I think this is one signing we are going to see Jacksonville make. I do believe that. I don't think they're letting both of those edge rushers go. And it's going to be one that will probably be very favorable to the team because he wants to be here. He's coming off an injury. You don't know for sure that he's going to be able to start the season. So because of that, you're probably getting him for cheaper. And while he was on pace to probably have his best season, he wasn't able to finish it. So it's still technically unproven. I think you get him back for a decent deal. And with Dan Arnold, it's really 50-50. Like, they might bring him back. It's cool if they do. Just don't pay him more than what he made before. I'd be fine giving him $3 million a year. So right now, considering what's left internally, and really the fact that Jacksonville has not gone on and signed anyone, they haven't held visits, they're clearly not that interested in bringing anyone else into the team. The cap space currently, $4.4 million. What they need to sign their draft picks in cap space is $3.1 million. Now, what I mean by that is that while the draft class will cost $9.9 million to pay them, there are also players who will not count against the salary cap because they will be replaced. So with that all considered, the net amount that the cap space changes when signing the draft class is $3.1 million. So they've got $1.3 million to work with still if they want to make moves. They've also got opportunities to kick cap down the road. I think even if they don't want to extend anyone, they could simply do it with a guy like Darius Williams. I think that's possible because I think he's going to stick around. Really do. I think he's going to be an important part of this team for a few more years. I really hope that for his sake. He's a guy who came here for a cheap deal. We've said that before. He's someone the team needs to value and treat well and take care of. And so, that's great as long as he plays good, and he sure as heck played good to finish the year. So we're going to kind of just look at this for a moment and how the cap space changes. This estimates your cap space is going up about $30 million next year, which I think is very possible. I mean, just in the real life world, there's inflation right now. Things are going up at the grocery store. The price of living costs more. And so money is worth less. There's more being printed, and ultimately the salary cap is going to go up in part because of that. The NFL also makes a ton more money because, quite frankly, their marketing is very successful. They also make a lot of money off gambling. There's a lot of factors in this. And so I think we are going to see the cap space go crazy over the next few years. Now, I wouldn't plan for that. I don't think they are either. I think that's a big part of the reason why people aren't getting signed, because they're probably looking at it like, hey, we're going to have the same amount available next year. So this number might not be that high. Say they bring back DeJuan Smoot. Let's do a deal here. So let's actually just do a 1-year deal, because it'll probably be a prove-it deal. Say he gets paid $3 million to be back with the team. He is being paid $5 million a year, but it's going to probably be a little less if it's a prove-it deal, because he's coming off injury, might not be ready for the season. And you don't know how they're going to recover as well from an Achilles tear. So say you make that move, you're going to need to free up a little bit of cap space, but you got DeJuan Smoot back this year. I think Marvin Jones would be a guy you might be able to bring back, and if you do, probably pay him about $4 million. So to get that, we've got a base salary here. We're going to add on an amount that gets the signing bonus and the 2023 base salary to $4 million. So he gets that in his pocket, and we backload the deal. So that amount is that. And so we'll change this to $4 million, and that would be your contract. So now we see Jacksonville a little under the cap space, but you got to free it up for your draft class, right? And so Dan Arnold, won't worry about him. Might bring him back later, but don't absolutely got to get him. So to free up cap space here, well, actually, let's do it with Darius Williams. So we'll restructure a little bit of money down the road. So when we do that, this pushes this in the next offseason, but you got about $6 million available. And you need 3.1. Let's also say the team makes one signing in free agency. And I'm not sure they will. But let's say they make a late signing to the team. I think you could see something like this. We'll use the guy I like a lot for Jacksonville, whether or not he comes here. Let's say Justin Houston does. Talking about probably about $4 million. He was paid 3.5 last year. Definitely over-exceeded it, but he's getting older. It's actually... we're a little over, so let's do right below that to free up. So we'll do... Let's actually do this. We'll give him 3,500 or 3.5 million. Throw in a void year. And 500,000 signing bonus. So what this does, just kicks a little bit of money down the road. It's only 250,000. Just make sure we're under the cap space, have room to sign the draft class, right? So you've got these guys back. You're adding one guy. You're probably going to see a signing like this, whether it's Justin Houston or not, for a cheap deal. I don't think it'll be cornerback, because I think they'll hit that in the draft. And then maybe they get a tackle, but I also think that's something they hit in the draft. I think edge rusher is probably the most likely, just because there will be opportunities like this with older players to get them pretty cheap. So you've got that. Now we look at 2024. Keep in mind, teams can backload deals. This is why Jacksonville's not doing a lot. Get all your guys re-signed, right? Now you've got 34 players under contract. You'll have another 9 with your draft class. You won't really carry any cap in this scenario. You're probably taking about $12 million away from the cap space here. So you got about $30 million available. If the salary cap does not change, that's $0 million available. Not a great situation. But you can move cap down the road in the worst case scenario and still bring back your guys, of which your big guys are Evan Ingram, Josh Allen, and Calvin Ridley. I think Ridley and Allen will be absolute must-re signs. I expect Josh Allen to play good enough to prove that. I think he did at the end of the season. I think with Evan Ingram, I think it's possible that maybe he walks, but I think the team values him a ton, and I think they'll get a deal done at some point. And they also, if they sign deals before this next season's over, you're probably not going to see the cap numbers change for that first season, which is 2023, or perhaps the final year of their last contract, because there's no reason to change it. They're already under this cap space, so just have your cheap year be in 2024. So you're going to have minimal cap hits for these kinds of guys. Ultimately, you look at all these guys, probably about $20 million that you're dealing with. And that's going to add on to the amount of players under contract, get you to your 51. And if the cap space goes up as expected, you will have a little bit of money available. You will have enough for your draft class, and you will have all of your guys back. You will also have all your draft picks from 2023, and you will also have all your guys that you select in the 2024 NFL draft, of which you will probably lose your second from the Calvin Ridley trade if you extend him, which I expect the team to do, and you will gain a third, at least, from the Jawan Taylor trade, which will likely be the 97th pick in the draft. So they will still have really good draft capital. The team will be even better that year. So why is Jacksonville not spending money? Because since they have not invested in a big-time free agent, which that can change. Maybe they go after a guy who's remaining. Maybe they go make a trade for a guy like Zadarius Smith, which that's fine if they want to make a move like that. It's possible. But because they're not doing anything like that, they're making it to where they can keep their core together, of which has been plenty for this team to be successful and to make the playoffs for not only this year, but the next season as well. And you also see the cap space shoots up a ton. You'll have Lawrence on his fifth-year option in 2025. That will definitely impact it, be a bit of money, but you'll have enough money to keep your guys around in 2025 as well, just with how big the cap space is. So that's why this offseason isn't as exciting as the previous offseason, because we're going to keep football exciting for all these years instead of going all out in 2023, putting it all on the line. And, if they win a Super Bowl, great, it's worth it. But if they don't, now you're in cap hell again. So that's what they're doing. As far as how I feel, there are free agents I would have taken. There are guys I would have signed for the amount they went for that I think would have helped you. You would have had a better team, and you're getting a deal that is a win for the team. I mean, for example, Sean Murphy-Bunting at $5 million was a good deal. I would have taken that. However, they didn't, and they'll have to take a cornerback. I think if they took him on a deal, that would eliminate that need. You could still take one if you'd like, but you're not taking one in the first round. You don't got to worry about it. Now you're in a situation where, are you going to feel really confident in a cornerback if, say, most of the really good ones and the good ones are off the board by 56? Now you probably got to take one in the first round. That's the situation they put themselves in. So I don't like that. And then you also talk about like CJ Gardner-Johnson, $8 million a year. Now that's a 1-year contract. That's still really good. And Jacksonville, quite frankly, could have taken that deal. Absolutely could have done it. You'd have to move around the cap a little bit, but it's possible. So there are moves I would have taken. Another example of one. Isaac Sumalo, a guy that Doug Peterson drafted from Philadelphia. or when he was in Philadelphia. $24 million over 3 years as one of the most underrated guards in the NFL. One of the best ones in the league. $8 million a year. Yes, please. I would have taken that all day. I thought that guy was going at least well into the double digits, at least in the teens. He went for $8 million a year. Jacksonville didn't jump on it. This was a free agency period where players were cheaper than expected, for the most part, aside from apparently Jawan Taylor. And you could probably even throw in other guys, at right tackle, left tackle, those kinds of positions. So, I wish they could have spent this offseason because of that, but hey, they're still taking an approach that keeps the core together. They're still going to be a lot better when they make all these selections in the draft. They have capital to address needs. It will not be a perfect roster, but it will be a better roster than they had last year. And that roster went into Kansas City and nearly beat the Chiefs. So I think it's all right. I think we're going to see really how good this team is next year. I think it's going to be a great year still. I think this team can make it to the championship game. I think they can make it all the way. I still think they can because the core is here and it's really about supplementing that. They're still going to do it in the draft. And I think this will be a really good team in the 2023 NFL season. So that's how I feel about it. Not exactly how I would have done it, but this is the smartest approach the Jaguars can take for the long term. And ultimately, when it comes to the end of next season and beyond, we will be thankful that they did it this way, assuming they don't explode, right? And I don't think they will. So with that said, I appreciate you guys watching this video. Hope to have more out here soon. Just really hasn't been a whole ton going on. Once we see more signings, we'll put out stuff for that. We also got the draft coming up. We'll talk more about it. And, eventually we're going to have a season to get to. Still a little ways away, but it'll come up before you know it. Football will be back. So thank you for watching. I hope you had a great time. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And finally, go Jags.